The cell was perfect. This is not a boast. It is the honest professional assessment of 47 independent engineers, 11 security architects, 3 independent review boards, and the Galactic Compact's own infrastructure certification division, all of whom reviewed the design before construction began and confirmed, in separate reports that collectively run to approximately 9,000 pages, that the cell was perfect. Structurally perfect. The walls were constructed from a composite material that the Compact's Materials Science Division had developed specifically for this project, a lattice-structured alloy that absorbed kinetic impact without transferring force, meaning that nothing short of a directed energy weapon at industrial scale could breach it from the inside. The floor was seamless. The ceiling was seamless. The joins between each surface were sealed with a molecular bond compound that had no mechanical weakness at any testable stress level. Electronically perfect. The cell contained no wiring, no data conduits, no power transmission hardware of any kind. All climate control, all lighting, all monitoring was conducted through external systems that terminated at the outer wall surface and communicated through the material itself via a passive induction system that left nothing inside the cell that could be accessed, repurposed, or tampered with. There were no switches, no panels, no interfaces of any description. Logistically perfect. The cell's single-access point A door, whose engineering specifications ran to 400 pages, was controlled by a system that required simultaneous authorization from 7 independent security officers using 7 physically separate authentication mechanisms, with a mandatory 60-second delay between each authorization that could not be overridden by any single authority below the facility director. The door could not be opened from the inside. It could not be opened from the inside because nothing inside the cell could interact with the door's mechanism. The door's mechanism was, by design, entirely external. Psychologically considered, the Compact's leading specialists in human behavioral science had been consulted at length during the design process. They had provided recommendations on environmental factors, light levels, temperature, sound, spatial dimensions to ensure that the cell's occupant remained in a state of psychological stability sufficient to prevent the behavioral deterioration that could produce unpredictable responses. The cell was designed to be endurable. Difficult, yes. Isolating, yes. But not maddening. The specialists had been very clear on this point. They had said a maddened human in a cell is more dangerous than a stable one. The design accommodated their recommendation. It was the right recommendation. It was, as Chief Containment Officer Sorathvel would later document at considerable length, not sufficient. From the personal account of Chief Containment Officer, SORATHVLLVETH Absolute Prime Maximum Security Facility, submitted to the Compact Oversight Commission post-incident, Standard Year 3961. The Commission has asked me to explain what happened. I have been preparing this account for 6 months, not because the events are complicated, they are, in their sequence, straightforward to describe. Because every time I try to explain what happened, I find myself explaining what I thought would happen instead, and the gap between those two things is so large that bridging it requires a level of intellectual honesty that I have had to work up to. I will begin with what I was certain of. I was certain the cell was sufficient. I had spent 4 years designing it. I had reviewed every precedent in the Compact's detention history. I had consulted every relevant specialist. I had stress-tested every component, every system, every interface, every material property. I had subjected the complete design to adversarial review. I had hired, specifically, a team of 4 security engineers whose only job was to find flaws, and they had found 12. I had corrected all 12 and subjected the revised design to a second adversarial review. The second review found 2. I corrected both. The final design had been reviewed by a total of 61 independent professionals. None of them found anything. I was certain the cell was sufficient because the evidence supported certainty. I was wrong. Not because the cell was flawed. The cell was not flawed in any conventional sense. The cell performed exactly as designed, every material property held, every system functioned. The door remained sealed until we opened it ourselves. I was wrong because I had designed a cell to contain a human, and I had understood human as a Category A biological classification, a set of physical parameters, a behavioral profile derived from psychological assessments rather than as a specific person. The specific person is where I fall. Wild. Her name was Dr. Mara Voss. She was the last human. And I had built the most secure cell in galactic history for a woman who had spent 53 years being the last human and who had developed, in those 53 years, capabilities that no assessment profile and no behavioral model and no psychological consultation had adequately measured. Because the capabilities were not physical, they were not even, strictly speaking, behavioral. They were something prior to behavior. They were what happens to a person who has spent 53 years as the last of their kind and has not broken. I did not know what to look for. I do now. From the facility intake record VETH absolute prime subject. VOSS, MARA human female, age 71 intake date. Standard year 3961, month 2, day 4. Physical assessment, consistent with human female 7th decade. Moderate signs of chronological aging within normal species parameters. No physical augmentation detected. Biometric baseline established. Psychological assessment. Subject presence as calm, cooperative, and cognitively acute. Response latency within normal parameters. No indicators of psychological distress, dissociation, or behavioral instability. Notable, subject asked the intake physician 3 questions about the facility's atmospheric system and 2 questions about the material composition of the intake corridor walls. Questions were answered. Subject thanked the physician. Security classification, tier absolute, single occupancy, maximum containment protocol. Personal effects none permitted. Contraband screening negative. Health status stable. Assigned cell block 0 cell 1. Special notation from intake physician. Subject was cooperative throughout the intake process. She had no visible reaction to the tier absolute designation. When I completed the intake and informed her she would now be escorted to her cell, she said, "Thank you. Before we go, the atmospheric composition in this corridor is running slightly high on CO2. About 0.3% above optimal. You might want to check the scrubber on level 2. I checked, she was correct. I have filed a maintenance request. From the personal account of Chief Containment Officer, SORATHVLL continued. I reviewed the intake record on day 1. I noted the atmospheric observation. I noted it as, subject demonstrates environmental awareness and possibly engineering familiarity. Monitor. I did not understand what I was noting. I understand now. She walked into the most secure facility in galactic history, and within the first hour of her intake, while being processed for maximum containment, she had assessed the atmospheric system of the intake corridor. Not casually, precisely, to within 0.3%. Without instruments. She has been the last human for 53 years. Before that, she was an environmental systems engineer for 16 years. Before that, she studied physics, materials science, and what the human educational record describes as mechanical engineering. She is 71 years old, and she has spent her entire life understanding how things work. She walked into my cell and she started understanding it. I did not know to be alarmed by the atmospheric observation. I was alarmed by day 12. From the facility monitoring log block 0, cell 1 days 1 through 30. Day 3, subject requested paper and writing implements for what she described as personal journaling. Request denied per tier absolute protocol, no materials permitted that could be repurposed as tools. Subject acknowledged the denial without visible reaction. Day 7, subject requested a meeting with the facility physician regarding what she described as a minor joint concern. Meeting conducted through the cell's communication interface. Physician assessed no medical concern requiring treatment. During the meeting, subject asked 4 questions about the cell's climate control response time and 2 questions about the filtration cycle frequency. Physician answered the questions. Post-meeting notation. I answered her questions about the climate system because they seemed like the kind of questions someone might ask out of general curiosity. Reviewing the conversation afterward, I am not sure they were. Day 12, Chief Containment Officer Sorathvel flagged subject for elevated monitoring after review of days 1 through 11 communication logs. Notation. Subject has asked, across 11 days of communication interactions, 47 questions about facility systems. The questions span atmospheric control, structural materials, power distribution, monitoring system architecture, and access protocols. Each individual question appeared contextually reasonable within its interaction. The pattern is not reasonable. She is mapping the facility. Day 13, enhanced monitoring protocols implemented. All communication interactions to be reviewed within 2 hours of occurrence. No information. About facility systems to be provided to subject under any circumstances. Day 14, subject made no requests. Subject engaged in what monitoring staff described as extended physical activity, sustained movement within the cell for approximately 4 hours. Day 15 through day 22, subject made no requests. Subject maintained consistent daily routine, physical activity, rest periods, what appeared to be structured cognitive exercises. She was observed sitting completely still for periods of up to 2 hours with no visible activity, which monitoring staff characterized as possible meditation or psychological self-regulation. Day 23, subject requested to speak with Chief Containment Officer Sorathvel directly. From the personal account of Chief Containment Officer, SORATHVLL continued. I agreed to the meetings. In retrospect, this was the correct decision. Refusing would have communicated information she could use. Agreeing told me more than it told her. Or so I believed at the time. The meeting was conducted through the cell's communication interface, a one-way audiovisual system that allowed the subject to see and hear me through a screen mounted on the cell's interior wall and allowed me to see and hear her through a monitoring terminal in my office. We were not in the same room. I was not inside the cell. I was not near the cell. I was in an office 3 levels above it. She sat in the center of the cell and looked at the screen. She said, Chief Officer Sorathvel, thank you for agreeing to speak with me. I said, you requested the meeting. What is it you want? She said, I want to understand something. I said, what? She said, why? I said, why what? She said, why this, the cell, the tier absolute classification, the level of resource the facility has put into my containment. I said, you know why? She said, I know the official reason. I'm asking about the real one. I said, the official reason is the real one. You are a threat to compact stability. She said, I am 71 years old. I weigh 58 kilograms. I have no weapons, no allies, no organization, and no resources. I am the last human. In what sense am I a threat to compact stability? I said, the Commission's assessment is classified. She said, I know, I'm asking you personally. I looked at her through the monitor. She was sitting completely still in the center of the cell, and she was looking at the screen with the specific quality of attention that I had, by day 23, come to recognize as her default mode of engagement with everything, the attention of someone who is gathering information, and has decided that the most efficient way to gather it is to be entirely present. I said, the assessment says that the last human free is a more significant risk than the last human contained. The reasoning is classified. She said, I understand the reasoning without seeing the document. I said, then why ask? She said, because I wanted to know if you understood it. I said, I wrote the containment protocols. I understand the assessment. She said, do you understand why it's wrong? I said, the assessment isn't. She said, the assessment is not wrong about me specifically. I am not personally planning anything that justifies this level of containment. I am 71, I am tired, and I have spent 53 years being the last of my kind, which is something I would not wish on anyone and which has produced in me a disposition towards stillness rather than action. She paused. She said, the assessment is wrong about containment. I said, explain. She said, containment assumes that the dangerous quality is something you can isolate, that if you put the threat inside a cell, the threat is inside the cell. She looked at the screen. She said, Chief Officer, I am going to tell you something that is true and that I am telling you because I think you are a professional who deserves an honest conversation. I waited. She said, the dangerous quality is not inside this cell. I said, you are inside this cell. She said, yes, and what I am is not a thing that can be celled. I said, what does that mean? She said, it means that what makes a human dangerous is not located in a human's body or a human's resources or a human's plans. It is located in a human's mind. And a human's mind in a cell, with nothing to do and nothing to work with and nothing but time, does not become less dangerous. She paused. She said, it becomes more dangerous, because it has nothing to do but work on the problem in front of it. She said, I have been in this cell for 23 days. She said, I have been working on the problem in front of me for 23 days. I said, what problem? She said, the cell. She said it simply, without threat, without drama, the way you state a fact. I said, the cell is flawless. She said, every cell how? As a flaw, the flaw is not always in the cell. Sometimes the flaw is in the assumption that the cell is sufficient. She said, I'm not telling you this to threaten you. I'm telling you this because I think, if you understood what I'm telling you, you would make a different decision about my containment, and that decision would be better for both of us. I said, what decision? She said, let me out. I said, that is not a decision I will make. She said, I know I had to ask. She looked at the screen for a moment. She said, thank you for the conversation, Chief Officer. It was useful. I terminated the communication. I sat in my office for a long time. Then I called my senior engineering staff and I said, review the cell, everything from the beginning. They spent a week on it. They found nothing. I filed the meeting record. I elevated the monitoring protocol. I added 3 additional review layers to the daily log analysis. I did not sleep well. Part 2, the work. From the facility monitoring log block 0, cell 1 days 30 through 120. Day 31, subject resumed what monitoring staff have classified as a structured daily regimen. Morning physical activity 2 hours, cognitive exercises 2 hours, rest period 1 hour. Extended sitting, the meditation or cognitive exercise pattern noted previously 3 hours. Evening physical activity 1 hour. The regimen is consistent. It has not varied by more than 15 minutes in any component since day 14. Day 47. Monitoring staff note that subjects' extended sitting periods, which were previously characterized as meditation, appear to involve subtle physical activity not visible on standard camera resolution. Enhanced resolution monitoring implemented on day 48. Day 48, enhanced monitoring reveals subject is not meditating during the extended sitting periods. She is moving her fingers very slightly. Consistent, precise movements. Pattern analysis in progress. Day 53, pattern analysis complete. Subject's finger movements are consistent with what the Compact's behavioral analysis library classifies as manual simulation, the physical practice of a procedural task using finger movements to represent hand movements that cannot be physically executed in the current environment. Humans and some other species use this technique to maintain procedural memory for physical tasks when physical practice is unavailable. She is practicing something she cannot currently do. Elevated to Chief Containment Officer Sorathvel for review. From the personal account of Chief Containment Officer SORATHVLL continued. The manual simulation flag arrived on my desk on day 53. I reviewed the enhanced monitoring footage. I watched her sitting in the center of the cell, apparently still, fingers moving in a pattern so subtle that the standard cameras had characterized it as rest. I asked the behavioral analysis staff, what is she practicing? They said, we cannot determine the specific task from the movement pattern alone. The movements are consistent with fine motor control of a complex mechanical operation. Beyond that, we cannot specify. I said, she is practicing a physical skill she does not have the materials to perform. They said, yes. I said, what does she have in the cell that she could perform a physical skill with? They said nothing. The cell contains no materials. The food delivery system provides sustenance in a form that requires no preparation and no tools. The hygiene system is automated. There is nothing in the cell that could serve as a physical object for a procedural task. I said, so she is practicing a task she cannot perform with materials she does not have. They said yes. I sat with that. She was in an empty cell. She was practicing something. You do not practice something you never intend to do. I reviewed the cell design for the 4th time. I found nothing. I increased the monitoring resolution again and I watched her for 6 hours. She sat, her fingers moved, her face was completely still. Her breathing was regular. There was no visible sign that she was doing anything other than resting. She was not resting. She was, in some sense I could not yet identify, working. In an empty cell. Working on something I could not find. From the facility monitoring log block 0, cell 1 days 120 through 200. Day 122, monitoring staff flag an anomaly in the cell's climate control readings. The CO2 level in the cell is running 0.1% higher than the external system's output would predict. Discrepancy is within the range of normal sensor variation. Logged for routine review. Day 131, CO2 anomaly persists. Now 0.15% above predicted, still within sensor variation range but trend is upward. Maintenance review requested. Day 138, maintenance review finds no fault in the climate control system. External. Readings are nominal. The anomaly is internal to the cell. Possible explanation, subject's metabolic output is slightly higher than the cell's atmospheric model was calibrated for. Model recalibration recommended. Elevated to Chief Containment Officer Sorathvel. From the personal account of Chief Containment Officer Sorathvll continued. I read the maintenance report on day 138. I read it 3 times. Then I called the facility's chief atmospheric engineer and I asked him one question. I said, if the CO2 level in a sealed cell is higher than the climate system's output predicts, and there is no fault in the climate system, what are the possible explanations? He said, higher metabolic output from the occupant, as the maintenance report suggested, or a very small breach in the cell's atmospheric seal that is allowing cell atmosphere to accumulate without equilibrating to the external system. I said the cell's atmospheric seal was certified as perfect. He said, yes. I said, by perfect you mean there is no detectable breach. He said, correct. I said, is there a difference between no detectable breach and no breach? He was quiet for a moment. He said, in theory, yes. A breach below the detection threshold of our instruments would not appear in a seal certification. I said, what would cause a subthreshold breach in that cell's material? He said, sustained localized pressure differential over an extended period. In simple terms, repeated mechanical stress applied to the same point over a long time. I said, how long? He said, dependent on the magnitude of the pressure. For that material, at any pressure, a human could generate months. Many months. I said, she arrived 4.5 months ago. He was quiet again. He said, Chief Officer, the manual simulation flagged on day 53. I said, yes. He said, what was she simulating? I said, we don't know. He said, do you know what she was doing on day 14 when the physical activity began? I did not know. I reviewed the logs. Day 14, 4 hours of physical activity in the cell the first day she had done that, before the manual simulation began. I reviewed the day 14 monitoring footage. I watched for 40 minutes before I found it. She had spent 4 hours on day 14 systematically pressing her palms against every surface of the cell. Every surface, floor, ceiling, all 4 walls, every corner, every edge. She had mapped the cell. Not visually, physically. She had mapped the pressure response of every surface with her hands. She had found the point. I did not know where the point was. The subthreshold breach was too small for our instruments to locate, but she had found it on day 14 with her hands. And she had spent the following 124 days practicing what she was going to do when she was ready. I ran to the monitoring station. I watched the current feed. She was sitting in the center of the cell, completely still. Her fingers were not moving. From the personal account of Chief Containment Officer Sorathvll continued. I want to document what happened next precisely because the record must be accurate. I arrived at the monitoring station at 1347. The current feed showed Dr. Voss in the center of the cell, seated still. I had my engineering staff on communication link. I had my security team on standby. I had the facility's emergency lockdown protocol ready to activate. I watched the feed. Oh, she stood up. She crossed to the northeast corner of the cell, the corner farthest from the door, farthest from the monitoring camera. The corner I had spent the least time observing because the door was my primary security focus, and the door was in the opposite corner. She pressed her right palm against the wall. She pressed it in a specific location, not high, not low, mid-height, specific. She stood there. I said to my engineering team, activate the atmospheric seal diagnostic. The diagnostic ran for 40 seconds. The result came back, seal integrity nominal. I said, how is that possible? My chief atmospheric engineer said on the communication link, the breach is below instrument threshold. The diagnostic cannot find what our instruments cannot measure. I said she found it. He said, yes. I said she found it with her hands on day 14. He said, yes. I said, and she has been working on it for 4.5 months. He said the Code 2 anomaly started on day 122. That is when the breach became detectable, below threshold but detectable as an anomaly. If the breach began on day 14, it took approximately 100 days to reach even that level. I said she has been applying pressure to a specific submillimeter point in a molecularly bonded wall for 100 days. He said, Chief Officer, what is the current Code 2 reading in the cell? I looked at the atmospheric display. 0.4% above predicted. Not within sensor vari. Ocean range. Above it. And rising. I said she is not pressing the wall to breach it. He said, what? I said the breach is the size of a fingertip. She has been pressing it for months and it is a fingertip-sized imperfection in a molecular bond. She cannot breach that wall with her hand, not in any time frame relevant to her. I said, so why is she pressing it now? I looked at the Code 2 readings. 0.5%. Rising. I said she is using it as a valve. From the personal account of Chief Containment Officer, SORATHVLL continued. I need to explain what I mean by a valve because the Commission's report characterizes what happened next as a security breach, and I want the record to reflect what it actually was. The cell's climate control system was designed to maintain a specific atmospheric composition inside the cell. To do this, it continuously exchanged a fraction of the cell's internal atmosphere with conditioned external air through an induction system in the ceiling. The induction system was external. The cell contained no interface for it. What the cell did contain was one subthreshold imperfection in the northeast corner, wall an imperfection that Dr. Voss had located by hand on day 14 and had been enlarging by fractions of a fraction of a millimeter per session for approximately 100 days. The imperfection was still subthreshold. The atmospheric diagnostic could not find it. Our sensors could not measure it. But it was there, and she was pressing it with her palm. And the Code 2 level in the cell was rising. I understood watching the feed and the atmospheric display simultaneously what she was doing. She was not trying to breach the wall. She was disrupting the pressure differential across the cell's atmospheric system. The climate control system maintained the cell's atmosphere by balancing internal and external pressure through the sealing induction system. That balance was calibrated to a sealed cell. The cell was no longer perfectly sealed. The imperfection in the northeast corner was exchanging a tiny fraction of the cell's atmosphere with the external environment at a rate the sealing system had not been calibrated to accommodate. And by pressing her palm against it, varying the pressure, opening and closing it by fractions, she was introducing an oscillation into the atmospheric system that the sealing induction system was trying to correct. Trying and failing. Because the sealing system had been designed for a sealed cell. The sealing system's correction algorithm was producing CO2 accumulation. The CO2 level hit 0.8% above predicted at 1412. My safety protocols written before Dr. Voss arrived, written for a standard containment scenario, required me to open the cell's access door if the internal CO2 reached a level that threatened the occupant's health. The access door control was external. I had to authorize it from my office. 7 simultaneous authorizations, 60-second delays between each. The CO2 hit the health threshold level at 1441. I started the authorization sequence. At 1449, the door opened. Dr. Mara Voss walked out of the most secure cell in galactic history. She was carrying nothing. She had brought nothing. She had needed nothing. Part 3 is after. From the facility emergency response log VATH absolute prime day 147 1449 through 1623. 1449, Block 0, Cell 1 access door opened under emergency atmospheric protocol. Subject Voss Mara exits cell. 1451, facility lockdown activated, all internal barriers sealed. Emergency response team deployed to Block 0. 1453, subject Voss located at Block 0 junction point. She is seated on the floor. She is not moving. She does not appear to be attempting to advance further into the facility. 1456, emergency response team reaches junction. Subject Voss cooperative, offers no resistance, is sitting with her back against the wall, eyes closed. 1457, team leader reports, subject appears exhausted. She said, and I am quoting directly, I just needed to get out of the room. I'm not going anywhere, I'm very tired. 1512, Chief Containment Officer Sorathvel arrives at junction. 1513, exchange between Chief Officer and Subject Voss, transcribed by Team Leader. SORATHVLL Dr. Voss, VOSS Chief Officer, SORATHVLL, you found the imperfection on day 14. VOSS day 12 actually. I told your intake physician on day 1 that the scrubbers needed maintenance on level 2. I was also telling your engineering staff that I know how to read an atmospheric system. I wanted to see if anyone would put it together. SORATHVLL, no one put it together until today. VOSS, no, I know. That's what took so long. I had to find a method that didn't require anyone to connect the pieces until I was ready. SORATHVLL, you spent 4.5 months engineering an escape from an empty cell. VOSS, I spent 4.5 months engineering an escape from an empty cell using NOTH. NG but time and a wall. Yes. SORATHVLL, why are you sitting here? You're out of the cell. The facility lockdown is active, but you know these corridors. You've been asking questions about this building since day 1. VOSS, because I said the truth in our meeting on day 23. I didn't want to escape. I wanted to get out of that room. There's a difference. SORATHVLL, explain. VOSS, I have been the last human for 53 years. I am 71 years old. I do not have a destination. I do not have an organization waiting for me or a plan to execute or a revolution to lead. I am just a person who cannot stay in a box. It is not political. It is not strategic. It is simply what I am. SORATHVLL, what are you? VOSS, human. 1516 1623, subject Voss remains cooperative. She is provided water and a meal at her request. She declines medical assessment initially, then accepts after 20 minutes. Health status, stable, moderately fatigued. Chief Containment Officer Sorathvel remains at junction throughout. From the personal account of Chief Containment Officer, SORATHVLL final section. I sat with her for 2 hours in the junction corridor. I want to document those 2 hours because they are the most important thing in this account, and the official log does not capture them. I sat across from her while the emergency response team maintained their position at the corridor entrance, and I looked at a 71-year-old woman who had just escaped from the most secure cell in Galactic history using 4.5 months of patience and a wall, and I tried to find the question I most needed to ask. I said, "How did you know?" She said, "Know what?" I said that there was a flaw. There was no flaw until you made one. The cell was certified perfect. How did you know to look for something that didn't exist yet? She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Nothing is perfect. That is not pessimism. It is engineering. Nothing that exists in physical reality is without imperfection. The question is whether the imperfection is at a scale that matters for your purpose. Your cell was certified perfect within the measurement capability of your instruments. But your instruments have limits. The cell existed at a scale below those limits." She said, "I have been an engineer for 50 years. I know that the thing that breaks a system is almost never the obvious weakness. The obvious weakness has been hardened. The thing that breaks a system is the assumption that no one is looking at." I said, "And you were looking at the molecular bond." She said, "I was looking at everything your instruments weren't looking at." I said, "Because you had time." She said, "Because I had nothing but time and a mind and a wall." Yes. I said, 4.5 months. She said, "I have been the last human for 53 years. 4.5 months is not a long time." I sat with that. I said, "Dr. Voss, I want to ask you something that is not in my official capacity." She looked at me. I said, "The Commission's assessment classified you as a threat to compact stability. Not because of what you were planning, because of what you represent. She said, I know. I said, the reasoning, and I will tell you this because I think you deserve to know it. The reasoning was that a free human, even the last one, constitutes a proof of concept. That a human exists and is free is evidence that humans can exist and be free, and the Commission assessed that this evidence in the current political climate was destabilizing. She said, a symbol. I said, yes. She said, they imprisoned me to remove a symbol. I said, yes. She was quiet. She said, and what does an escaped human constitute? I said, a different kind of symbol. Well, she said, yes. She looked at the corridor ceiling. Her eyes moved across the infrastructure, the conduits, the junctions, the support structure with the same quality of attention I had watched her apply to everything since day one. Reading the environment, understanding it. She said, Chief Officer, I want to tell you something. I said, yes. She said, I did not escape because I had a plan for after. I escaped because I am a person and people should not be in boxes. She said, what happens next? That is a real question and I do not have a complete answer. I am 71, I am tired, I am the last. There are things that ended with my generation that I have made my peace with ending. She said, but I am not willing to end in a box. She said, that is not a political statement, it is a personal one. I said, I know. I said, Dr. Voss, I am going to recommend to the Commission that your containment classification be revised. She looked at me. I said, not released. I do not have the authority for that, and I will be honest, I do not know if release is the right answer for the reasons I have described. But tier absolute containment has been demonstrated as insufficient. The Commission needs to understand why. She said, why are you telling me this? I said, because I have spent 4.5 months on the wrong side of this situation, and I owe you a direct conversation. She said, what is the right side? I said, I don't know yet, I am going to find out. She looked at me for a long time. She said, thank you. She said, for what it is worth, you built a very good cell. I said, it wasn't enough. She said, no, but that's not a flaw in the cell. The cell was, within its design parameters, exactly what it was supposed to be. The flaw was the assumption that the design parameters were sufficient. She said, you can build a perfect cell. You cannot build a cell that is perfect against a person who has nothing to do but find what the cell doesn't account for. She said, that is not a human superpower. It is just what happens when you give a mind time and a wall. She paused. She said, we have always had time, and there has always been a wall. She looked at the corridor around her. She said, we have always found what the wall doesn't account for. I submitted my resignation the following morning. Not because I had failed, but because the failure was not correctable within the framework I had been operating in, and I needed to think about that outside the framework. The note I attached to the resignation said, I built the most secure cell in galactic history. I want the record to show that I understand now why that was never going to be enough. I stand by that. Postscript from the Compact Council Historical Archive. The Compact's Commission reviewed Dr. Voss's containment classification following Chief Containment Officer Sorathvel's resignation and report. The review took 11 months. The Commission's final determination was that tier absolute containment was not appropriate, could not be made appropriate within any practical design framework, and that the fundamental premise of the containment that a human could be effectively isolated from their own capacity to act was not achievable. The Commission's reasoning, as documented in the review record, was 11 pages. The core finding was one sentence. The quality that makes a human dangerous is located in the mind, and the mind, given time, will find what the cell does not account for. There is no cell design that accounts for all possible things. There is therefore no cell that can contain a sufficiently motivated human indefinitely. Dr. Mara Voss was not released. She was transferred to an open facility structured, supervised but not sealed, a place with windows, with other people, with, she was told, access to a workshop. She accepted the transfer without comment. She was seen, on her first day at the open facility, sitting at a workbench in the workshop with a cup of coffee and a collection of mechanical components she had requested permission to work with. The facility director asked what she was building. She said, "I don't know yet, I'm just seeing what's here." The facility director filed a note that read, "Subject appears content. She has been in the workshop for 6 hours. She has not asked about exits, boundaries, or security protocols. She has asked about the load-bearing specifications of the workbench, the material composition of 3 of the components, and whether there is a better coffee available." There was better coffee available. She drank it. She went back to work.